The birth of a generation is usually met with a narrative of progress, an unspoken promise that the world inheriting them will be more efficient, more wealthy, and more advanced than the one left behind by their predecessors. But for Gen Alpha, the cohort born between 2010 and 2025, that promise has been quietly rescinded, replaced by a structural economic trap that is closing before they even reach their teenage years. To understand the Gen Alpha nightmare, one must first look at the erasure of the middle class, not as a slow decline, but as an active, accelerating liquidation. We are witnessing the first generation in history whose economic utility is being challenged by silicon before they have even learned to read, and whose purchasing power is being devoured by a monetary system that requires ever-increasing levels of debt just to maintain a baseline of survival. In the mid-20th century, the middle-class dream was a statistical reality. A single income could support a family of four, purchase a home at 3 times the annual salary, and guarantee a pension. Today, that math has become a relic of a lost civilization. For a member of Gen Alpha, the entry price into that same middle-class life has inflated to nearly 10 times the median wage in major urban hubs. The cost of basic human necessities, shelter, education, and healthcare, has decoupled from the reality of labor. We see this in the skyrocketing prices of assets. Houses are no longer homes, they are speculative vehicles for institutional investors. This means that by the time a child born in 2015 reaches adulthood, the concept of owning land will likely be a luxury reserved for the top 0.1%. They are being born into the subscription economy, a feudalistic digital landscape where they will rent their software, rent their transportation, and rent their very shelter from corporations that never die and never stop raising prices. This isn't just about the rising cost of living. It is about the total collapse of the value of time. Inflation is the invisible tax that punishes those who work for a living while rewarding those who own for a living. For Gen Alpha, the currency they will eventually earn is being debased at a rate that outpaces productivity. Every hour they spend in a classroom or a future workplace is worth less than the hour spent by a boomer in 1970, yet the cognitive load required of them is exponentially higher. We are preparing this generation for a high-stakes competitive environment while simultaneously devaluing the reward for that competition. The psychological toll of this cannot be overstated. We see the symptoms already in the iPad kid phenomenon, a generation overstimulated by digital dopamine but undernourished by physical stability. This digital tethering is the perfect preparation for a life of algorithmic management, where their attention is the product and their financial future is a series of microtransactions. Then there is the shadow of artificial intelligence, the great displacement. Unlike the Industrial Revolution, which replaced muscle with machine, the AI revolution is replacing the middle management and knowledge work that formed the backbone of the middle class. The traditional path to stability, becoming a lawyer, an accountant, a programmer, or a middle-level executive, is being automated. For Gen Alpha, the skills being taught in schools today are largely obsolete. They are being trained for a job market that will be dominated by large language models and autonomous systems capable of performing cognitive tasks in milliseconds that would take a human years to master. This creates a barbell economy, a tiny elite of AI owners and developers at one end and a massive pool of low-wage service workers at the other. The middle, the bridge that allowed for social mobility, is being burned down. The absurdity of this economic moment is that we are producing more wealth than at any point in human history, yet the share of that wealth accessible to a child born today is shrinking. We see a divergence where the stock market hits record highs, while the percentage of young people who can afford a $500 emergency expense hits record lows. This is the silent depression of the 2020s, a period where the surface-level metrics of GDP and unemployment look stable, but the internal organs of the economy, the ability to start a family, to build equity, to have a stake in the future, are failing. Gen Alpha is the first generation to be born into a world where the default state is debt. They are born into a system that has already spent their future tax dollars to bail out the mistakes of the past. They are inheriting a planet that is ecologically taxed and an economy that is financially bankrupt. When Gen Alpha realizes that the ladder of social mobility wasn't just pulled up, but was actually dismantled and sold for parts, the social contract will face its ultimate test. To understand why this trap is closing around Gen Alpha, we must move beyond the surface-level symptoms of expensive milk or high rent and examine the architectural flaws of the global financial system, a system that has transitioned from rewarding production to rewarding the mere possession of assets. This transformation began decades before the first alpha was born, rooted in the 1971 abandonment of the gold standard, which effectively unanchored the world's currencies from physical reality. Since that moment, the system has operated on a policy of permanent credit expansion. For the middle class, this meant that wealth was no longer something you saved. It was something you borrowed. But for Gen Alpha, the credit card is maxed out. They are inheriting a world where the debt-to-GDP ratios of developed nations have reached levels historically seen only after total world wars. This debt is not a harmless number on a ledger. It is a claim on their future labor, a systemic short on the life of every child born today. The mechanics of this erasure are driven by Cantillon effect, the economic principle that those closest to the source of money creation, banks and large corporations, benefit, while those furthest away, the average worker, pay the price through devalued currency. As central banks pumped trillions into the economy to stave off various crises in 2008 and 2020, that money didn't trickle down to create jobs for future generations. Instead, it flowed directly into assets like stocks, real estate, and tech monopolies. This artificial inflation of asset prices created a wealth gap that is now a permanent barrier. For a boomer or an early Gen Xer, the system allowed for equitable appreciation. You bought a house, and its value grew alongside your wages. For Gen Alpha, the appreciation has already happened. They are entering a game where the board has already been bought up by institutional players like BlackRock and Vanguard, who are increasingly pivoting toward becoming permanent landlords of the human race. This institutionalization of the middle class's traditional assets is the systemic greed that defines the current era. It isn't just that things are expensive. It's that the system is being optimized to prevent ownership. If you own nothing, you are a permanent revenue stream for someone else. This is why we see the push toward everything as a service. From the software Alpha uses for school to the autonomous cars they will eventually hail, the goal is to ensure they never accumulate equity. When a generation cannot accumulate equity, they cannot accumulate power. They become economic serfs in a high-tech feudalism. Simultaneously, the education-industrial complex has functioned as a secondary trap. For 40 years, the narrative sold to millennials and Gen Z was that higher education was the only escape from poverty. This created a massive influx of degrees, which led to credential inflation, where a master's degree is now required for entry-level roles that once only required a high school diploma. Gen Alpha is the victim of this saturation. They are being told to prepare for a knowledge economy that is being cannibalized by generative AI. The systemic failure here is the lag between institutional education and technological reality. They are saddling future students with debt for skills that an AI subscription can perform more accurately. Furthermore, the rise of AI is not merely a tool in this system. It is the ultimate capital optimizer. In a traditional economy, capital needed labor to grow. A factory owner needed workers. AI breaks this social contract. For the first time, capital can grow without labor. A corporation can scale its output by 1,000% using autonomous agents while actually reducing its headcount. For Gen Alpha, this means the labor share of income is projected to plummet. When capital no longer needs labor, it no longer needs to pay a living wage. It certainly doesn't need to fund a middle class. The policy decisions of the last 2 decades have also prioritized financialization over industrialization. We stopped building things and started shuffling paper. This led to a hollowed-out economy where the only way to get ahead is to be part of the financial elite. This creates a genetic aristocracy. If your parents aren't already in the asset-owning class, the systemic barriers to entry are now almost insurmountable. We have effectively recreated a caste system under the guise of a meritocracy. The final G-letter 1 ECD and G-Kim of the system is the monetary debasement required to keep the debt bubble from bursting. To pay back the interest on the massive debts accrued by previous generations, the system must keep the printing presses running. This ensures that the cost of tomorrow is always higher than the cost of today. Facing this reality requires a departure from the toxic optimism of the 20th century and an entry into a period of cynical resilience. For Gen Alpha, the traditional milestones of success are not just delayed. They are being rendered obsolete. The forecast for their future is not a single catastrophic collapse, but a long grind, a world where the digital and physical realms diverge into a stark hierarchy. In this future, the middle class does not disappear into thin air. It bifurcates. The dark forecast suggests that Gen Alpha will be the first generation to fully inhabit the metaverse, not as a game, but as an escape. As physical assets like real estate and travel become prohibitively expensive, the system will offer them digital consolations. Why worry about the cramped reality of a 200 square foot rental pod when you can own a digital palace in a virtual world? This is the ultimate opiate of the masses, a way to pacify a generation that has been economically disenfranchised. The danger here is a total loss of political and economic agency. If Gen Alpha spends their energy fighting for digital status while their physical world is owned by a handful of trillion-dollar entities, the cycle of serfdom becomes permanent. However, within this dark forecast, there is a path of stoic adaptation. To survive, Gen Alpha must become the most anti-fragile generation in history. They will likely be the ones to finally break the college-to-debt pipeline, moving instead toward decentralized learning and proof-of-skill economies. We may see a return to multi-generational living not as a sign of failure, but as a strategic pooling of resources to combat institutional landlords. The family unit may become the only viable economic fortress for Gen Alpha. The AI displacement also carries a hidden human premium. As the world becomes saturated with synthetic content, anything that is provably human will skyrocket in value. Gen Alpha's survival may depend on leaning into the very things that AI cannot simulate: genuine empathy, physical presence, and complex nonlinear creativity. For the Alpha who can master both the tool of AI and the essence of humanity, there is a narrow window of superproductivity. They will not be replaced by AI. They will use AI to do the work of 100 people, but they must do so while maintaining ownership. The lesson for this generation is simple: be the one who uses the tool, or you will be the tool. Looking toward 2040 and beyond, the great transfer of wealth from the boomers will finally occur. But it will not be the tide that lifts all boats as promised. Instead, it will be the final sorting hat. Those with inheritance will solidify their place in the new aristocracy, while those without will be left to navigate a hyperinflated world. This will lead to a period of intense social volatility. Gen Alpha will likely be the generation that has to rewrite the social contract entirely. Whether this takes the form of a universal basic income funded by robot taxes or a more radical restructuring of property rights, the status quo cannot hold. The nightmare is the current trajectory, but the future is still a battleground. Gen Alpha is being born into a storm, but it is precisely in the center of the storm where the old structures are torn down, making room for something different. The ultimate forecast for Gen Alpha is a transition from quantity of life to quality of meaning. The 20th century dream of endless accumulation is dead, killed by its own excesses. Gen Alpha will be forced to find value in community, in resilience, and in the mastery of their own minds in an age of total distraction. They are the legacy generation. They are the ones who will decide if humanity remains the master of its tools or becomes a historical footnote in the age of the machine. It will be defined by the alphas who refuse to be subscribed, who refuse to be automated, and who find a way to reclaim the value of their time.